any point, regardless of where we're at, Cindy Stottle is there with a mic, and please don't hesitate because we want to have full transparency of what we are doing. Secondly, I want to pose a question to you, and you're going to have an opportunity to share. But whenever we do that, whether it's a one-to-one, they pose these questions, and then they say, go. And I thought, I can't pull it out at the time. So I'm going to pose it to you now, and then you can dwell and think upon that before we get there. So the question is, I'd like you to think of an experience when you felt like a stranger. And was there anyone there to help you? Okay, so you can think about that. So I want to welcome you to today, and I'd like to first start out with sharing with you over the course of the next few weeks. We're going to be sharing stories, we'll have music, hopefully, food, and even possibly dancing. That's what will consist of for the next few weeks. And I want to first start with introducing the Sanctuary Committee. So if you're a member of the committee, and please, I'm a little nervous up here, so just raise your hand. Please stand if you're on the Sanctuary Committee. Lloyd and Tom and Cindy and Bob. And we also have had many people who have volunteered. If you have helped with transportation, helped with childcare, donated food items or donated furniture, you guys can stand as well. It takes a community. It really, really does. And I thank you for that. Other people who have helped us may not be here or have moved on to other things have been Scott Taylor, who hopefully, possibly, may be joining us for one of these. Some of you may remember Monica Herrera, who a few years ago, she shared during the morning conversation and sermon her story. She is a DACA person who used to work or had a connection with Lloyd through Toastmasters. Yeah. Susan King, who basically is, due to health concerns, just is with us through YouTube. Pastor Mark is really the one who kind of got this going, this whole movement. So here we are. You're gonna, with one person, you can pose, let me pose the question again. Share an experience when you felt like a stranger, and did anyone come to help you? I'll give you about 3 to 5 minutes. We'll see, I'll monitor. Go ahead. Just talk with your neighbor. You may go. That's the educator within me. About a couple more minutes and then we'll move on. If we could bring this to a bit of a close. Three, two, one. You can't take the teacher out of a person who's done it for over 30 years. Okay. I'm going to, if you would like to share, I would be more than happy, but I'd like to share an experience that I had. In 4th grade, I was born and raised in Portland, Oregon, lived out in this area most of my life, but in the 4th grade, I went to Robert Gray Elementary in Southwest Portland, which is now a middle school. And my father, bless his heart, wanted to live in the burbs. The burbs were just coming alive back then. And so we had a house built over in Linwood area on Terra Linda Street. It's the only Cape Cod in the whole area because my mom was from Jersey. So I started 4th grade, and all of a sudden our house sold, but our house was not finished. So our family lived in that apartment complex up by Cedar Hills. It was called Cedar Hills Manor. I don't know what they call it now, townhomes or something like that. And we lived there for a few months, had the holidays in that place. And then when our house was finished, we moved again. So I experienced 2 moves and 3 schools in 1 year. That was the most difficult educational experience for me. They taught pronouns, hadn't done there, just finished it, and it was gone by a long time by the time I got to William Walker. So I was behind. It was very, very challenging for me. But the blessing of it was, even though we had moved, and I felt like a stranger. That's my experience. But when I got to Ridgewood, which is where I went to for a few months, the class I was put into, someone who lived right at the bottom of our street in the Southwest, played with him all the time, was in that class. And that was very welcoming to me. So that is my story. So would anyone like to share their experience? Don't all jump up at the same time. Cindy has a mic.
I went to a jazz camp when I was a sophomore or a junior in
high school. And it was down at Brigham Young in the Holy City.
Oh.
And I was not one of them, but they had the rules, and I read all the rules. If you had a two-piece bathing suit, you had to cover it with something, and all these different things. And so I tried to obey the rules and everything. Rode down there on the bus. I think it was an overnight ride. That didn't bother me a bit. That was great. Just people, Get down there. There's nobody to pick me up. There was supposed to be somebody to pick me up. Had to wait. Had to get the bus man to find phone to call somebody to get me to come get me and all of that. So I'm late for the big welcoming meeting. I've got this huge berry sacks. They weigh a ton. They're big. And I don't know where to put it. So after the meeting is done, everybody disperses and disappears to wherever. And I'm like, well, where do I put my horn? And they said, well, in the music room. It's over there. That's a huge place. I didn't know where anything was. I couldn't find the music room. I stumped around forever. I got over there, and the guy said it's going to be $3 to rent a place to hide your sax. I didn't have any money. Nobody told me that. I burst into tears. He said, never mind, stop crying, But other than that tiny bit of kindness, nobody talked to me all week. My supposed roommate found out I wasn't one of them, and she moved out. So I never even met her to find out who she was. I hung a sign on the door saying, I'm Jane and I'm Pam and I'm lonely, and I would be happy if only you would come in and talk to me. Nobody did. I was there the whole week. Nobody talked to me. It was like I had stranger printed across my forehead. They knew somehow.
Wow.
And of course, my bathing suit didn't go over at all. But, oh, wow. By then, it didn't really matter.
Anybody else? Oh, here we go.
As most of you know, I'm ordained. When I was doing my internship while at seminary, I guess it was we, decided that we would request an internship in Washington, D.C., okay? I grew up in Montana, and there were no black people in the community. It was heavily Native American in many respects, but not black. And the church in Washington, D.C. had rented an apartment for their, what they called, vicars. And we were on one side of Marlborough Pike. Julie thought before we moved there that was the most charming name for a street. On our side, everybody in our apartment complex, which was large, was white except for the maintenance staff. You go across the street, it was all black. And we moved in, and one of my jobs was to go to all the hospitals in the metro area and visit anybody who identified as Lutheran. They weren't necessarily members of our congregation. So I would spend all afternoon driving around, going to a hospital, visiting with people I had never met, didn't know. And one night I got a call to go to a hospital in the middle of the night because there was a couple there were wondering what they should do with mom, whether they should pull the plug or not. And I was supposed to drop in there and bring some wisdom. I think I was totally out of my depth. I know I was. And I felt kind of lost, vulnerable. I was probably learning a ton, but it was very disconcerting along the way. And, you kind of move on. But I had one ace in the hole. I was white. And I don't care what you say, that puts you in a different position. And we were middle class, that puts you in another advantaged position.
maybe possibly just one more. Who's it gonna be? There we go.
I have spent a lot of my life being the odd duck. My mom was deaf, and I was an only child, and there weren't a lot of kids around, so I never learned some of the social skills that you need. And there have been a lot of times in my life when I've kind of looked around and felt like nobody cares, but there's always been somebody that has come along and said, hey, come and have dinner with us, or come to the grocery store while I go, keep me company. So it's really important.
And Gretchen, you were one of the first people when we were new at St. Andrew who came up to me and spoke to me in the most welcoming way.
Wow, thank you.
Well, thank you for sharing. These stories are what bring us together and creates empathy and compassion, friendships. And so we're going to move on. We hope to share stories every week we have a class. And so today we are very, very fortunate to have Steve Claiborne and his wife Glenda. Now, they are members of St. Andrew, but you don't see them very often. And that's because they share God's love around the world in their jobs, in their careers. Steve is with Mercy Corps, and so he's gonna be sharing with us some of his experiences. And so, Steve? Oh, I don't think you need this. I don't think you need that.
Good morning, or good afternoon, yeah. It's a privilege to be here. I think you were talking about privilege a few minutes ago, and be back at St. Andrew. We joined St. Andrew in 2000, something like that, Glenda? We moved to the neighborhood. This was the closest church to our new house, so that's how thoughtful we were. And Don Parsons was the pastor at that time, so it's always good to see Claudia, and thanks for inviting us back. So I can talk for a long time about, I've been in many, many countries and 50 years more or less of working international, but I thought I would just kind of focus on my early years. First, set the context a bit about, that you know already, but context about what's happening in the world and world of refugees and asylum seekers and immigration. Then talk a little bit about my personal story, my early years, if I can say, particularly around sanctuary movement. And I'm from Tucson, Arizona, originally, so if any of you remember, the sanctuary movement started in Tucson, in South Tucson. And then maybe a few words, kind of a call to action for this group that's doing wonderful work for St. Andrew. So let me just, I don't want to bore you, but just kind of set the context. There are 110 million refugees or displaced people in the world today. That's about 1%, a bit more than 1% of global population. That's a lot of people. Of those 110 million people, 35 million are refugees, meaning people who don't live in their own, who are forced out of their countries for one reason or another. 62 million are internally displaced, people who, let's say, lived in Portland and now have to move because Portland has been attacked and they have to move, somewhere in the rural area. So displaced populations. And those are the kinds of communities that Glenda and I work with mostly as displaced groups, trying to help them recover from being forced out of their homes and restart their businesses or find shelter, food, those kinds of things. And then there's 5.4 million asylum seekers, so people who have officially requested political asylum of some kind. So that statistic is only the official statistic, 110 million. Those are only people who have actually registered officially with the United Nations or some agency. So there must be, I don't know what the estimate is, but probably double that if you think about people who haven't registered for whatever reason. They can't, they're fearful of registering. There's a number of reasons. So we also talk in the US about migrants a lot, particularly these days. There's 281 million migrants officially. So a migrant is a person who lives in a country in which they weren't born. So we have a lot of migrants in our country. But these are not the people we're talking about. We're talking about refugees, people who had to leave because of war, persecution, famine, a number of things. So of that amount, where do they come from, mostly? More than 1/3 of these people are from Syria, Ukraine, and Afghanistan. So you think about those three countries. 1/3 of those countries, those populations. Syria, 13 million people are still displaced. Either they're refugees or they're in their own countries. Afghanistan, I think you know the story well, and you're helping the Afghan family resettle here. And so where do they go? Where do they end up? Do they end up here? I'll get to that in a moment. But the country that hosts the most refugees, 10% of all global refugees live in Turkey. Germany has 2.1 million refugees. 5 million refugees are hosted in the Horn of Africa, one of the poorest places in the world, but they're hosting 5 million refugees. The U.S. last year, in 2022, we took in how many refugees? Any guesses? 30,000. The year before that, in 21, we took in 15,000, and then even less in the earlier years in the Trump presidency. It's really astounding. Germany, 2.1 million refugees, US, 30,000. So we have a ways to go. And I'll explain a little bit of why that is, because it wasn't that way. I worked many, many years ago when I was in the Philippines. We worked in a refugee camp there for Indochinese refugees. So this was in 1986. So at that time, if you remember, that was the end of the Indochina War, and there were the boat people. So at that time, the U.S. took in hundreds of thousands of refugees from Indochina. So there's definitely a reason why it's not that we can't, nor that we don't want to. There must be other reasons for that. So we have a challenge in this country as regards refugees, and so let me just give you kind of a little bit of my history around sanctuary in the early years, just as an example. And as you know, the U.S. signed the convention, actually the Refugee Act, which was signed in 1980, Carter administration. So that act by Congress recognized the 1951 Convention on the Rights of Refugees. In other words, our obligation to take in refugees when people are displaced, and not to, the word is refoulement, not to send them back unless they're willing to go back home. So this is 1980. In 1974, sorry to go way back, in 74 I had graduated from high school, and I had no prospects, as my parents would probably have said at the time. A friend of mine's father had a friend in Guatemala who worked for the Maryknoll missionaries. The Maryknoll missionaries are a Catholic ministry out of, I think, New York, somewhere. And they said to me and my friend, hey, would you guys like to go to Guatemala? And being graduates of high school with no plans for anything, we said, that sounds like fun. And so we went to Guatemala for a year and lived with the Maryknoll missionaries, and I worked with a Maryknoll brother, who was doing some small projects in a very rural community in Guatemala in 1974, 75. And that changed my life completely. Then all of a sudden I said, oh, wait a minute, there's more going on than just me. There's a lot of things that I could do in this world, and that's really, I think, where I started. And I still remember those days, and I remember those sisters who were running a small hospital with no electricity, a brother who was trying to basically do small projects, water projects or whatever. I mean, people who really lived, and this was on the border of Guatemala and Mexico, so it was pretty rural. We were out there. And so I learned a lot, and it really inspired me to do something more than what I had thought. So in 1982, 1980, the Central American War, I went back to school. I thought, okay, I better get a degree if I want to do something. Went to school, and the Refugee Act was passed. The war in Central America was ongoing, in Guatemala in particular. U.S. policy at the time, Reagan administration had just come into office, was to not accept refugees from Central America for political reasons, because they weren't really seen, even though we were accepting people from Iran and other parts of the world. 3% of all asylum seekers from Central America at the time were admitted in the United States. 60% of Iranians who applied for political asylum were admitted. So there was definitely a political tone to this. There was a man named John Fife, pastor at Southside, it wasn't a Lutheran church, I think a Presbyterian church. It's a Presbyterian church, and he ran into a Quaker named John Fife. Pastor John Fife was a Quaker community who was a farmer, rancher in southern Arizona, who had picked up a couple of Guatemalans in northern Mexico and asked them what they were doing on the road hitchhiking. And they said, well, we're fleeing the war in Guatemala. So John Fife and the pastor from the Southside Presbyterian, Jim Corbett and Fife, started in 1982 because they didn't get status. They started the sanctuary movement in this Presbyterian church in South Tucson, which is basically 1 square mile incorporated city in Tucson. And at the time, I was in grad school, failing grad school at the time. And a friend of mine said, hey, these people are working in Guatemala, this Guatemala issue, do you want to help? So I went and met them, and they said, yeah, can you go to Guatemala? Because we need to document these cases. And I said, sure. So I got on a bus and went to Guatemala with my camera and went into villages and took photos of destroyed houses and kind of to provide some documentation so that these people, their asylum cases could be heard. So the railroad, and we did other things. We did that, just to cut it short, that church was founded in 1906 for the Papago tribe. In other words, think about that church, 1906, created to serve the Papago Indian reservation. Their Tohono now is the name of that tribe. And all of a sudden it becomes the sanctuary church for Central America. And they, John Fife Jim Corbett and Pastor Fife created a movement of 500 churches across the United States and brought in 13,000 people from Central America, Guatemala, El Salvador, basically at that time. And so I was privileged and honored to be part of that for about a year or so. And we did bring people all the way from the border. So we would drive down, find people on the border, reunite families. And then there was a number of churches in Mexico who would provide sanctuary on the way to the border. They would get to the border, and you can look this up on the internet. It's an amazing story of these two people. There's a church on the Nogales side of the border who would provide, and I remember going in to the office of this priest, and he said, look, we've got all these deck of cards. I'm going to give you some trade secret now. There's a smuggler's trade secret. In the border, you can get a card, an ID card that allowed people who lived in Nogales to come across to Tucson side, or to the Nogales, Arizona side. So it was like a pass. So we were sitting in his office. We had a family with us this time. He had his deck of cards, of ID cards that his parishioners had given him, because they used those to go back and forth. And he looked at the cards, looked at the family, and said, okay, you're Maria so-and-so, you're Jose so-and-so, and they gave them the cards, the border cards. They then went, and then we coached them, because Guatemalan Spanish is very different from Mexican Spanish. So you have to be really careful in what you say and how you say it. So gave them some tips on how to get across the border, get through and they got across, and then we picked them up on the other side, took the cards back, and then took them to Southside Presbyterian Church. So that was the beginning of the sanctuary movement, the Underground Railroad, as they called it informally. And that's kind of where I really started my work, I would say, real work. So just to finish the short story, the Guatemala situation in El Salvador is really personal for me because that's where I started this. Guatemala for me is the special place and still is for me. But after that, I decided maybe I should do this more formally. I joined the Peace Corps. I ended up going to the Philippines where Glenda and I met. Then ended up in a refugee camp in Indochina, or Indo-Chinese refugee camp in the Philippines, providing assistance. But at that point, those were official, as I said earlier, those were official state-sponsored, U.S. government-sponsored refugees, boat people. So those people got everything they needed. They got food, shelter, education. I was teaching at a refugee camp. We were teaching English and cultural awareness for people who were coming to the U.S. and sponsored by many churches, by Lutheran churches, Catholic churches. A lot of people sponsored. Hundreds of thousands of Vietnamese, Cambodian, Lao citizens came to the U.S. that way. So it shows you the power of what the U.S. can do if we want to. This is the challenge, I think, for us, and maybe the challenge for as we think about this is how to influence U.S. policy in a way that lives up to what we know we can do and have done in the past. And currently, we're not, U.S. I don't think, as a country, we're doing a really stellar job in terms of helping refugees, political refugees, or other kinds. We're caught up. I can say this from a personal point of view. We're caught up in a political moment on the border that doesn't seem to. I'm sorry. Oh, sorry. Sorry. It's because I'm going on a tangent, so I start to. So that's my, short story. Since then, I did go back to grad school, and I joined Mercy Corps 20 years ago. That's why we came to Portland. And that work has been with all kinds of different communities around the world. I think I've been to more than 60 countries working for Mercy Corps. And most recently, I was in Ukraine, Glenda was in Ethiopia. We're not always in the same place. I remember one point you were in Jordan and I was in China, and then another point I was in Yemen and you were still in Jordan. I can't remember anyway. So it's been part of our life for 40 years, and a real privilege to have been able to provide some sort of assistance to those who need it most. So this is where we are as a community, as a faith community. And it's, as I said, it's really great to be part of the sanctuary movement here, and thank you guys for starting it. And if you help one, you help many. So you're just doing really good work, and I really encourage you to continue to go forward. I'm going to stop there because I don't want to go too far, and I'm not well heard.
Any questions?
I'd like to make a comment. So I just finished reading a memoir by Raul Zamora, who is a journalist who started, it's called Solito, and it just tells the story, his story as a 9-year-old boy he started in El Salvador, but step by step, going through Guatemala and then going through Mexico and that long, hard journey, and tried to make the border crossing 3 times before they made it. And I really highly recommend it. And Solito, Solito, and his name is Raul Zamora.
Okay. Got questions or anything?
Steve, the numbers you shared are horrific. Could we get like that information? Those are the kind of numbers that allow us to speak intelligently about the situation in a way that, when you hear the media and things in the news, you don't really have any perspective, and this provides perspective that allows us to speak to the issue in a way that can be helpful.
Sure. Yeah, you can. It's on the web, unhcr.org. United Nations High Commissioner for Refugee, unhcr.org. .org. You can pick up all that information, or we can, if you think we need to publish it somehow here, I'm happy to put together, yeah. CR. I think is it .org? I think so, yeah.
Yeah, we think of Turkey as a very, not a Western country, and yet you say they have, they're hosting 10% of all displaced people in the world. How do they do that with their government that we don't really think very highly of?
Yeah, well, it's part of its location because Syria borders Turkey.
So the
Iraq
government does
borders
not
Turkey.
support this?
Lebanon also supports millions of, about 1.5 million refugees, probably from Syria. There's 13.5 million people displaced from Syria still. I think that's more than a third of their population. So along that southern border with Syria, and then you have Iraqi refugees, you have refugees from Central Asia. I mean, a lot of it's just geography. And
But we have geography with Mexico, and we do not accept refugees. So my question is, how has the government responded to the need? How has the Turkish government responded to the need? Is there a model for us to look at?
yeah, no, the Turkish government provides a tremendous amount of assistance to people.
Aren't
And
they
even
paid something from the European Union?
they do get
No,
they get
stay there because they don't want them coming to Europe.
yes, that's true. That's part of it. So, but they're part of the EU, so there's an obligation. So they're under. If you want to be a member of the EU, you have to follow a lot of EU. You have obligations that you must commit to. So they are essentially bound by those agreements, EU agreements, for supporting refugees.
It's probably good to mention that USA funds a lot of the programs.
I guess speak from the question. It's important to note that the U.S. government provides funds a lot of the UN-led humanitarian operations. Yeah.
They get a lot of assistance, and they have a lot of. They allow a lot of agencies to work there. I said they allow a lot of foreign organizations to work for Turkey as well to provide.
I was just gonna say, when I look back on my grandparents and their parents, they came in, and they had things that they had to prove, closer, yeah. They weren't immigrants, but, yeah, okay, immigrants. But they were coming in, like I have them from Norwegian and Sweden. And I've seen the writings on them, but they had to set some information down as far as what they were going to do, where they were going to go, and they had to work and support themselves. This is not exactly what I'm hearing from you. Does that make any sense?
Are you trying to say that the people who are coming in are not supporting themselves?
Well, I'm only going from like my relatives and reading up on the ancestry, that how they came in and what they had to prove that they could do. If I remember it right, a lot of them stayed together as a group when they came in. It was more comfortable for them. They understood their language more than, I mean, not everybody speaks Swedish.
I think I understand your point.
Yeah.
The context has changed from 100 years ago. The context has changed dramatically.
Yes.
In terms of what services are available, what support is available. The communities themselves still provide the primary support networks for refugees from any country.
So it's a little more complicated today.
It is much more complicated. The other thing that's very unusual is that because of what's very unusual from my perspective is for current refugees is that, or immigrants. Sorry,
I don't think it's working.
Okay, it's dead.
It's
not working.
dead.
I can just stand here. I mean, what's interesting, and maybe Glenda, is that now because we're so connected globally, transportation, you can cryptocurrency, any kind of internet, Skype. Most immigrants here and whether refugees or they're economic migrants, their obligations are so strong back home now. So much of their income goes back to their home countries. So the remittance, they call it remittances, so much of the requirement now as an immigrant in the United States. Before, 100 years ago, pretty hard to send money home, pretty hard to contact your relatives. You came and you were here, and you made a life of it. Now you're an immigrant, you come, you have to make a life of it here, and you have all these obligations to send money home to your families in the countries you came from. So to me, it's an added burden. I mean, it's a blessing that you can be still in contact in the most remote part of the world now via the internet. But that phone call also comes with an obligation, and that's always a financial obligation of some kind. So in some ways it's easier, and in some ways it's much more difficult to be an immigrant.
And the government changes too.
Yeah.
As far as the rulings.
Government changes, yeah.
And maybe the church as well. I'm thinking about Lutheran Immigration and Refugee Service, which has been around a long time, and I think it's been renamed recently. I don't know what they're able to do. I can recall in the late 70s when boat people were arriving and helping families resettle. And I think that was probably through LIRS. I don't know the status of LIRS in the last decade.
In recent months, I think it's been renamed
Global
Global Refuge, something like
Yeah.
that.
Mhm.
Just one note. Yeah.
I could use my teacher's voice. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Chris, I don't know that this is.
Is there a red light?
No red light. Okay. All right. I don't know if this goes on a certain way. Is that better? Yes. Okay. All right. Our time is quickly going. Isn't that wonderful? I have so much more to share, but we do want to get home for the Iowa game, so. Go Hawks. Okay. I'm so glad that Steve was sharing some definitions, and we do have a time where we want to share some of those. Today is not the day. I'm only going to define very simply for you sanctuary. And the definition I'm using is a place of refuge or safety. So with that in mind, we're going to briefly, for the very little remaining time that we have left, we're going to find out how this all came about here at St. Andrew. First of all, let me share that in 2016, when our country was going through how can I say, such a challenging time, my observation was, I need, for myself, for others, I need to do something positive. And that was in 2016. 2017, Pastor Mark made a request, brought something to the congregation that if anyone would be interested in receiving education and training in the area of sanctuary, that's how the group formed. We were a study group who met once a month for 6 months, and there were people from all over the area. I believe I think it was strictly Washington County, if I'm not mistaken, Lloyd. During the training that we had, we did all sorts of different events in addition to educating ourselves. In 2016, the Oregon Synod declared itself a sanctuary synod. And in August of 2019, the ELCA became the first North American denomination to declare itself a sanctuary denomination. And they actually had a really interesting statement. I was going to share it later, but in case I don't get to it, the ELCA publicly, and I'll just read it because I don't, shorten things very well. So the ELCA publicly said that the ELCA publicly declares that walking alongside immigrants and refugees is a matter of faith. That's powerful. And it's so true. At that time, there were more than 100 congregations and 5 synods across the ELCA who identified as sanctuary. So, in February of 2020, our team introduced a proposal calling for St. Andrew to become a sanctuary congregation. We developed a declaration and we shared it at a table talk, but my mind, because of COVID, is so messed up. I can't remember the order of things, and I truly apologize for that. We decided, Pastor Mark really wanted it to be on a Pentecost Sunday. And so we had it all planned and ready to go, and then all of a sudden, COVID happened. And so we kind of put it off for a year. We weren't sure if we were going to do it via Zoom, but we put it off for a year. And then on May 23rd, and I had to get this confirmed, I can't remember who told me, but thank you. May 23rd, 2021, there was a congregational meeting in between services, and we took the vote and became a sanctuary congregation. So on the table, you should have, and I don't know, Cindy, do we have any others in case people need one? We have a copy of that declaration. And so we'll kind of get through it. We are at looks like about 11 minutes before 12, and we do want to get home for that game. But we'll go through this. You're welcome to take it, but we will go through that. And I'll just start with this. And again, if you have any questions, you need to have anything clarified, that's important. Please raise your hand and Cindy will come to you. So on the front, we have at the top, calling for St. Andrew Lutheran to be a sanctuary congregation. And what we have on the front side here is the biblical basis, and we have the historical basis. And actually, as Steve was sharing, the historical perspective with the Lutheran Church, and me not being raised Lutheran, sorry, I married into it, but it makes me so proud. So let's just quickly go through. I don't think I'm going to read everything verbatim, but there is definitely a biblical basis in the Old and the New Testament. And one of the things that really became, and so many things birthed out of 2016, one of them was a group of people who call it Matthew 25. And if you read Matthew 25, it tells you everything about sanctuary. Maybe just the second bullet, that Mary and Jesus were refugees because they were fleeing Egypt. In the third bullet,
To Egypt.
what did I say?
They found sanctuary in Egypt.
Thank you. I don't know what I said, but she's the authority. All right. Correct me when I'm wrong. Romans 15:7 admonishes us to welcome one another, therefore, just as Christ welcomed us for the glory of God. And then the last one, Jesus said we would see him in the hungry, the thirsty, the stranger, the naked, the sick, and the prisoner. So the historical, I really find that this is really interesting to me. The historical perspective is, first bullet, after World War II, 1 in 6 Lutherans in the world were refugees and displaced persons. That's amazing. Lutherans in the Lutheran Church in this country, with the participation of 6,000 congregations, resettled 57,000 refugees in the United States. Second bullet, after the fall of Saigon in 1975, St. Andrew Lutheran, us, were among the Lutheran congregations that sponsored over 50,000 refugees from Vietnam, Cambodia, and Laos. And there are people within I don't know that they're here today, but I do know for a fact the Vaughel family remember that distinctly. And if you know Sawatna, she's there on spring break right now. Her family was part of that who came from Cambodia. Quite a story there. Third bullet, dangerous times brought people who had to flee their homes in the Middle East due to war. St. Andrew worked with the Lutheran Community Services to resettle, provide shelter, and support to the Alajarab family. And there are people here, I know the Facos worked heavily with that. If you did, I'm sorry. Well, my husband, Beavers, great family. There are also people who were with us, Nuha, who used to, a friend of Scott Taylor's, that Lutheran church that was closed, Light and Life or something like that. Yeah, Nuha, who speaks, I think it was Persian, I can't remember, maybe it's Farsi, I'm not sure. Anyway, apologies. We used to go out on a monthly basis, Nuha and I, and there was a lovely guy from PSU who worked with Lynn Santelman. See how it spreads out? He wanted to help. And in terms of a lot of the legal issues, his husband was actually, get this, an immigration attorney, did all sorts of work at no cost. Amazing. And just a little update, our family went from here to California because that's where family was. Turned out to be way too expensive. Ended up in Ohio, and I believe they may still be there. I don't know, I've lost complete contact. But the father did pass away with COVID. So I still remember I was sitting on my couch and Nuha texted me in regards to that. So, but I'll tell you, that mom, can she cook? Holy gosh. And that's how a lot of refugees, that's how a lot of them get to a place of stability when they open up their restaurants. So, let's see. Just a quick reminder, I'm going to skip some. Oh, I do want to do this one where it starts with 10 million sisters and brothers from Central and South America living in shadows while contributing many gifts and talents to the wonderful diversity of this nation. And I'll tell you, my work in teaching all of my work was in North and Northeast Portland. Proud to be a Portland Public Schools retired teacher, and I have worked with so many refugees over the year, and they are the hardest working people. And yes, they do live in large groups. That's so they can survive. And it's an honor and a pleasure to have done that. But it also made me think of who was on our committee, Monica Herrera, who was brought to this country as, I think she was 5 years old, her family, undocumented, living, and her parents are still in Hood River. She was raised in Hood River and currently does, as far as I know, still live in the area, and wonderful, wonderful person. And as a DACA, she did a lot of work with us as well. Let's see. Okay, so I'll let you read that. We're kind of really, really running short of time. But based on those things, we decided we wanted to be a sanctuary congregation. So if you flip it over, it says, we recognize that sanctuary encompasses a wide variety of actions. That doesn't only mean they're going to come knocking on the door, and that's not what we're talking about. Sanctuary should be a part, let me restate that. Sanctuary, I want it to be a part of my everyday life. If something's happening and I can intervene in a positive, safe way, that's sanctuary, go for it and do it. So it encompasses a wide variety of actions. So what we came up with, we as a congregation and as a human being are committed to education, advocacy, accompaniment, shelter and safety. And there's a reason why shelter and safety is the last one. But we do start with education, and we continue to this day to educate ourselves. If you look at that third bullet, I'm not going to go over every one because there is simply no time. Building relationships through worship and other activities with immigrants and interfaith partners. Now, you know that we are working with the Malik Alad, Lord have mercy. We're working with Amina, the Malik Zada family. And technically, we are not co-sponsors. We did not enter into that today. We received a call from Lutheran Community Services, can you pick them up at the airport? They're Cindy, Scott, Bob, we went out there, picked them up, and took them to the hotel that was arranged by Lutheran Community Services. How I like to describe it is we are building a relationship with them. They are a wonderful family, and just FYI, next Sunday, Amina will be sharing her story with us because she wants to thank this congregation for everything that we've done. So, I'll just go on from there. Advocacy. There are things that we did in our training, vigils that we went to. Sometimes Emerge, a group within Washington, well, it's within actually statewide and even beyond that, who work with refugees. They have an accompaniment program when someone is DACA or when someone has to have things updated. They need to have advocacy, someone to go with them who can help them with the language. Okay? That is an accompaniment. Under accompaniment, it could be a wide range of activities. If you look at the second one, seeking ways to provide financial support when appropriate and needed because of hardships imposed by immigration-related proceedings. A couple of things with that. This wonderful congregation provided, we do have a line item, a little thing about money. We do have a line item, and if people want to contribute to that on a basis at any time, please do so. But because of the generosity of this congregation, Amina, who has had tremendous dental needs, we were able to provide necessary dental procedures that were not covered under the insurance plan that they have. Not only this congregation, but someone in the community, Libby Calhoun, contacted a dentist that she goes to, and the lady did significant dental work at no cost. It's amazing. Sanctuary happens everywhere. And currently, we are looking for a second car for Amina. Does have her driver's license. And she used to drive also in Afghanistan, so it wasn't totally foreign to her. But we are working, so if anybody knows, we really need a car that is for a three-seater, because they do have 4 children, and they have a Camry now, so when they have to go places, I just don't ask how they all get there. So, but it's all they have, and also the hardest working family. Amina is in English. Nasir, her husband, works 40 hours a week. He goes to English class 3 times a week. And not only that, he does DoorDash when he's not working. They are industrious people and truly want to become independent. So if you if you know of any cars at a reasonable cost, please let Tom is in charge of that. He's getting all that information, and so we would really appreciate that. And I just want to, no, the game started. 30-0 already, no. So shelter and safety. I just want to make this clear, because there are people who just think, and I don't mean to sound mean about it, but there are people who just think that, we're going to be bringing people here, not ICE is going to be here. That's not what we're talking about. It can happen in many, many ways, and I'm going to read both of these points. The first bullet says, providing material and or financial support as we are able for sister congregations. Augustana Lutheran, really into that. Cedar Hills United Church of Christ, right down here. We were in training together. They were a sanctuary congregation before we were. We have talked, and if they sponsor somebody, maybe we can provide the food. That's the type of thing that we are talking about. And then the last bullet, responding to the call to offer temporary physical shelter and safety to immigrants and migrants at the risk of deportation. If you read that last sentence, it says requests will be considered on a case-by-case basis. There is a protocol in which this happens. It's not the fact that someone knocks on the door and you bring them in. That's not what we're talking about. It's discussed, it's analyzed, and there's a decision. That's how it works. Okay? Ooh. So, we still have a closing yet. Y'all sit down. Cindy's going to close us with a prayer.
Appropriately titled God of Departures. God of Departures, thank you for being the God of movement and belonging. We confess that we have created a world in which there are native citizens on the inside and immigrants on the outside. We are grateful that in the scriptures you reveal to us the normalcy of movement, that in its pages we find people who move for the same reasons people still move today. Help us to internalize the words of Paul, to know deep in our hearts that the only citizenship that matters is in the kingdom of heaven. As much as we long for place, we need you to show us how to make room for others. Expand our vision, our sense of family and country, our knowledge that ultimately we all belong to you, not to the places where we happen to be born. Give us eyes to see the human movement in our midst as we find ourselves in a time of growing